Damian Cross signed the divorce papers the same way he signed billion-dollar acquisitions, without hesitation. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of his Park Avenue office, the late afternoon sun turning the Hudson River into liquid gold. On the polished walnut conference table lay a single cream envelope. Inside it was the end of his marriage. He uncapped his Mont Blanc pen slowly, almost ceremonially. "Have it delivered tonight," he told his attorney without looking up. His voice was calm, controlled. Final. Across from him, Lila Monroe stood by the window, arms folded, her reflection layered over the city like she already belonged to it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone reinforced what Damian believed. Evolution required shedding weakness. And in his mind, Savannah was weakness. She had grown quiet over the past year, too sensitive, too withdrawn, not polished enough for the board dinners at the plaza, not strategic enough for the future he was building. A billionaire CEO couldn't afford emotional distractions, especially not a pregnant wife who no longer fit the image. 5 months pregnant. He pushed the thought aside. "She'll land on her feet," Damian muttered. "She always does." What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the quiet woman he was discarding had walked away from something far larger than his tech empire. Something older, something powerful, and something that already owned a silent portion of cross-tech dynamics. As Damian pressed the pen firmly against the signature line, ink flowing in a sharp, permanent stroke, he felt relief, control restored, narrative rewritten. But far downtown, in a discreet townhouse overlooking Central Park, a phone vibrated beside a closed leather journal. Savannah Whitmore looked at the caller ID, and for the first time in months, she didn't cry. She simply whispered, "So it begins." The FedEx envelope arrived at 7:42 p.m. Savannah heard the knock while standing barefoot in the kitchen of the townhouse overlooking Central Park. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. The early autumn air drifting through the cracked window carried the distant hum of traffic from Fifth Avenue. For a moment, everything felt almost peaceful. She knew that feeling wouldn't last. When she opened the door, the courier avoided eye contact. "Signature required." Of course it was. Her name looked smaller than she remembered on the digital screen as she signed with a steady hand. 5 months pregnant, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater, she did not look like the wife of a billionaire CEO. And tonight, she no longer was. She closed the door gently. No dramatic collapse. No shaking hands. Just silence. Savannah placed the envelope on the marble counter beside her MacBook Air. The gold-embossed law firm logo confirmed what her intuition had already accepted hours ago. Damian never liked unfinished business. She slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. Page after page slid out. Asset disclosures, property transfers, relocation clauses. A 72-hour vacate notice for the Park Avenue penthouse. Temporary spousal support capped at a number that would have insulted her if she didn't know exactly why it was structured that way. He thought she had nowhere to go. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. The baby shifted, a small flutter beneath her palm. "I know," she whispered. "I know." There was one paragraph that made her pause, a request for a paternity test. The air in the room changed. Not rage, not hysteria. Something colder. Outside, the Manhattan skyline glittered like nothing had happened. Damian was probably at the plaza by now, shaking hands, building alliances, rewriting his future. He believed he had calculated every risk. What he didn't calculate was the trust fund structured 20 years ago under a different last name, or the voting shares quietly held in escrow. Savannah gathered the papers neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and closed her laptop without opening it. Then she reached for her phone. There was only one person she needed to call, and for the first time in years, she was ready to use her real name. The chandeliers inside the plaza shimmered like falling diamonds. Damian Cross stood beneath them with effortless confidence, one hand resting lightly at the small of Lila Monroe's back. Cameras flashed as they entered the grand ballroom, the Manhattan elite already gathering for the annual Innovation and Capital Summit. Champagne flowed, laughter echoed. The skyline beyond the tall windows glowed against the darkening sky. He looked composed, unbothered, victorious. "Mr. Cross," a reporter called smoothly, stepping forward. "Is it true you've separated from your wife?" Damian adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, understated, deliberate. "We've chosen different paths," he replied evenly. "I wish her well." Lila's red Dior gown caught the light as she tilted her head closer to him, a silent reinforcement of the image he wanted the world to see. Strength, progress, forward motion, no vulnerability. Inside, however, something flickered. Not guilt, but irritation. The timing wasn't ideal. The SEC inquiry rumors had already stirred unease in the market. Personal headlines were a distraction. Across the ballroom, executives whispered. Investors observed. Damian felt their eyes measuring him, recalculating risk. He lifted a glass of champagne. "To growth," he announced lightly to the small circle forming around him. They laughed. But at that same moment, in a quieter corner of Manhattan, Savannah sat alone in the townhouse library. A single lamp illuminated the leather-bound spines lining the shelves. Her phone buzzed again and again with news alerts. Crosstech CEO appears solo at gala. Insiders confirm divorce filing. Pregnant wife absent. She didn't open the articles. Instead, she opened her laptop. The Caldwell Sovereign Capital portal required a secondary authentication code. She entered it calmly. Numbers filled the screen. Ownership percentages, voting blocks, strategic leverage. Downtown, Damian believed he was shaping the narrative. But the market did not care about narratives. It cared about control. Back at the plaza, Lila leaned close to Damian's ear. "Everything is moving faster than expected," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Good." What he didn't realize was that the speed wasn't in his favor. And somewhere between the champagne toasts and the flash of cameras, the foundation beneath his empire had already begun to shift. The Hamptons were quieter in the fall. Some Everett Caldwell stood alone on the terrace of his oceanfront estate, the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond manicured hedges and white stone balustrades. The wind carried salt and distance. In his hand rested an iPad, displaying a live stock ticker. Crosstech dynamics fluctuating in narrow, anxious increments. He watched without expression. Inside, the house was still. No staff hovered. No guests lingered. Everett preferred silence when markets shifted. His phone buzzed once. Savannah. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back inside, past framed photographs of global leaders, handwritten notes from presidents, and architectural renderings of projects his capital had quietly financed. Caldwell Sovereign Capital never sought headlines. It preferred leverage. The phone buzzed again. This time, he accepted the call. "So, are you ready?" he asked. Not hello. Not how are you. There was no tremor in Savannah's voice. He requested a paternity test. Everett's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in his composure. "And the apartment?" he asked. 72 hours. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, strategic. 5 years ago, Savannah had rejected her inheritance. She wanted a marriage built on equality, not advantage. Everett had warned her that powerful men often loved what they believed they controlled. Now the lesson had come due. "I won't step in publicly," Everett said evenly. "Not yet." "I'm not asking you to." That answer shifted something inside him. Outside the study windows, waves crashed steadily against the shore. Markets were built on perception. Control was built on timing. Crosstech's voting structure appeared airtight, but Damian Cross believed his majority stake insulated him. But Caldwell Sovereign Capital held layered instruments, convertible notes, silent equity, escrowed shares accumulated slowly over years. Savannah had never used them, until now. "You understand what this triggers," Everett said quietly. "Yes." Board review, emergency shareholder meeting, media scrutiny, a war without noise. In Manhattan, Damian was likely celebrating momentum. In the Hamptons, Everett opened a secure email thread marked contingency. He typed only 2 words: proceed quietly. And for the first time since his daughter walked away from his empire, Everett Caldwell felt something unexpected. Not anger, not regret. Pride. Monday morning opened red. Damian stood in his corner office before the markets fully stabilized, while watching Crosstech Dynamics dip 3.8% within the first hour of trading. The numbers scrolled across the Bloomberg terminal in sharp, unforgiving lines of white and red. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't normal. "Investor jitters," Lila said smoothly from the conference table, flipping open her MacBook Pro. The divorce headline spooked a few institutional funds. "It'll correct." Damian didn't respond immediately. His reflection in the glass looked steady, but his jaw had tightened. He had weathered worse volatility during acquisition cycles. This felt different. "Who's selling?" he asked. "Nothing major," she replied. "Retail volume. Some minor rebalancing." Minor. Yet someone was buying. A quiet accumulation. Steady, disciplined. Not aggressive enough to trigger alarms, but precise enough to matter. But Damian leaned closer to the screen. "Pull the ownership breakdown," he ordered. Within seconds, charts populated the monitor. Layered entities. Shell funds. Proxy holdings. Clean. Almost too clean. "Have legal flag any new voting blocks above 2%, he said. Lila hesitated, barely noticeable. Already in motion. He nodded, but unease crept under his skin. By noon, the drop stabilized. Financial news outlets framed it as temporary turbulence. Analysts reassured viewers that Crosstech's fundamentals remained strong. But fundamentals weren't what bothered Damian. Control did. In a midtown townhouse overlooking Central Park, Savannah sat with a leather folder open beside her. A single page rested on top. Escrow activation confirmation. She closed her eyes briefly as the baby shifted again. "Steady," she whispered to herself. "I'm back at headquarters." Damian's assistant entered quietly. "Sir, we've received a formal inquiry from a shareholder group requesting a governance review." He turned slowly. "What group?" She glanced down at her tablet. "Caldwell Sovereign Capital." For the first time that day, Damian Cross felt something unfamiliar. Not panic, not yet, but pressure. The kind that builds silently beneath foundations, long before buildings fall. The prenatal clinic on Madison Avenue smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Savannah sat alone in the softly lit examination room, her coat folded neatly over the back of a chair. A muted television in the corner played a daytime talk show no one was watching. Outside the window, Manhattan moved at its usual relentless pace. Taxis weaving, pedestrians rushing, life continuing. Inside, time felt suspended. 5 months today, the technician said gently as she adjusted the ultrasound wand. "Everything looks healthy so far." Healthy. The word landed deeper than she expected. Savannah watched the black and white image flicker on the screen. A small curve, a steady rhythm, proof of something innocent growing in the middle of chaos. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Unknown number. She ignored it. A second buzz followed. A notification from a financial news app. Crosstech stock rebounding slightly after its morning dip. Analysts praising Damian's decisive leadership during personal transition. She almost laughed. "Would you like to know the gender?" the technician asked. Savannah hesitated. "Yes." A brief pause. A soft smile. "It's a boy." The air shifted again. Not heavy, not fragile. Different. She pressed her palm gently to her stomach. "Hi," she whispered under her breath. For a fleeting second, the pain of the divorce, the humiliation of the paternity clause, the looming board battle, all of it faded beneath something far more powerful. Responsibility. Strength. When the appointment ended, she scheduled the next visit herself. No assistant, no driver waiting outside. Just her and the quiet echo of her own footsteps in the hallway. As she stepped onto Madison Avenue, the autumn wind brushed against her hair. She pulled her coat tighter and opened her phone. Missed call. Damian Cross. She stared at the screen. He had never called during work hours before. Not once. The phone buzzed again. This time, a secure notification from Caldwell Sovereign Capital. Emergency shareholder session confirmed. Savannah exhaled slowly. Damian thought this was about custody leverage. He thought it was about money. But as traffic lights changed and the city roared around her, Savannah realized something he hadn't yet understood. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about legacy. The elevator ride down from the Park Avenue penthouse felt longer than it ever had. Savannah stood alone inside the mirrored walls, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, the other gripping the handle of a single carry-on suitcase. The digital panel counted down the floors in silent red numbers. 42, 38, 31. 5 years of marriage reduced to one suitcase. She had returned only once after receiving the 72-hour notice. Not to argue, not to plead, just to collect what mattered. Her MacBook Air, a leather-bound journal, 3 books from her nightstand, while including a worn copy of Meditations. Everything else, the designer furniture, the art curated for Damian's image, the walk-in closet lined with couture, felt like stage props from a life already dissolved. The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby. The doorman straightened awkwardly when he saw her. "Mrs. Cross," he began. She offered a soft correction. "Whitmore." The name felt unfamiliar on her own lips, yet grounding at the same time. Outside, Fifth Avenue moved with its usual indifference. Black SUVs idled at the curb. A woman in heels hurried past, talking into her iPhone. No one noticed the pregnant woman quietly stepping away from a building that had once symbolized power. Across town, Damian was in a strategy meeting. "Contain the narrative," he instructed sharply, pacing in front of a wall-mounted display showing ownership charts. "The Caldwell inquiry is procedural, nothing more." But as Savannah's car pulled away from the curb, not a chauffeured Mercedes this time, just a simple black sedan she'd ordered herself, a notification pinged across every board member's secure inbox. Escrow conversion initiated. Voting rights, pending activation. Damian's assistant froze mid-sentence in the conference room. "Sir, you need to see this." Back in the car, Savannah looked out at the Manhattan skyline shrinking behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. She simply opened her phone and typed a short message. "I'm ready." Some departures are defeats, others are declarations. And Damian Cross had just lost more than a wife. He had lost the illusion of control. By Tuesday afternoon, the boardroom felt colder than usual. Damian stood at the head of the long glass table, sleeves rolled precisely to his forearms, projecting control. Behind him, a floor-to-ceiling screen displayed Crosstech's ownership map, neat, layered, and suddenly unstable. "Escrow conversion doesn't automatically shift majority," he said firmly. "It's procedural leverage, nothing more." Around the table, directors exchanged glances. Procedural didn't usually move markets. Lila Monroe sat to Damian's right, composed as ever. Her charcoal blazer was sharp, her posture immaculate. She had always been the steady one during turbulence. "Investor sentiment is sensitive," she added smoothly. "If we appear defensive, it feeds speculation. We stay calm." Damien nodded. He trusted her. What he didn't see was the second phone resting face down beside her legal pad, a private line separate from company devices. That phone vibrated once, a single coded message, position secured. Hours earlier, Lila had finalized a quiet transfer, not of Crosstech stock, but of her personal holdings. She had exited just enough to protect herself before the next phase unfolded. Damien believed Caldwell Sovereign Capital was testing him. He had no idea that another fund, Orion Strategic, had been receiving carefully curated financial whispers for months. Not lies, just timing. Inside information delivered at moments that maximized volatility. And Lila had been the one guiding the rhythm. Back at headquarters, a junior analyst entered the boardroom with pale urgency. "Sir, Orion Strategic just disclosed a 6.4% stake." The room shifted. But Orion was not passive capital. It was predatory. Damien's jaw tightened. "Since when?" "This morning." Lila leaned forward, feigning concern. "That explains the unusual buy pressure." Damien exhaled slowly. Two aggressive shareholders circling at once was coincidence. It had to be. Across town, Savannah sat in a quiet office inside Caldwell Sovereign Capital's Manhattan branch. Documents were stacked neatly before her. No theatrics, no panic. She had anticipated resistance. She had not anticipated a third player. Her phone buzzed with a secure update. Orion confirmed. Savannah's eyes narrowed slightly. This board battle had just become something else entirely. And for the first time, Damien Cross was no longer the only one miscalculating the room. The emergency board session was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp. By 7:45, the Crosstech's executive floor was already sealed from media access. Assistants whispered in hallways. Security badges were double-checked. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a pre-trial hearing. Damien entered the boardroom in a navy suit, tailored to precision, his expression composed but unreadable. Overnight, financial media had picked up the Orion Strategic disclosure. Headlines were no longer speculative. Hostile positioning? Leadership instability? He ignored them. What mattered was the math. When the screen flickered to life, legal counsel began outlining the updated ownership structure. Caldwell Sovereign Capital's escrow conversion was now active, fully recognized voting shares. 32%. Orion Strategic held 6.4%. Damien still retained significant equity personally, but no longer absolute control. "See, this is coordinated," one director muttered under his breath. Damien leaned forward. "Orion and Caldwell have no known alliance." "Not formally," legal counsel replied carefully. That distinction unsettled the room. At that same hour, in a discreet conference suite 3 blocks away, Savannah sat across from Nathan Reed. He had been quiet through most of the preparation. Sharp, observant, strategic. "Orion's involvement wasn't ours," he confirmed. "They're opportunistic, but they don't move without signals." Savannah folded her hands. "And who's signaling?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Back in the Crosstech boardroom, Lila presented a stability projection, projected earnings, expansion pipelines, long-term AI contracts. Her tone was calm, reassuring. "We remain fundamentally strong," she concluded. But then a new slide appeared on the screen. Unscheduled liquidity movement. Executive-level transactions. The room went still. Damien's eyes shifted slowly toward Lila. Her posture remained composed. "Personal diversification," she said evenly. "Filed within regulatory guidelines." The timing, however, aligned perfectly with Orion's acquisition window. Coincidence? Again. or pattern. The chairman cleared his throat. Given recent volatility and shareholder pressure, we must consider a temporary governance review. Temporary. The word echoed louder than any accusation. For the first time since signing those divorce papers, Damian Cross felt something fracture beneath him. Control wasn't slipping. It was being peeled away. Layer by layer. Damian did not wait for the governance review to unfold quietly. By late afternoon, his legal team had filed a supplemental motion in family court, one designed not for justice, but leverage. Request for immediate paternity verification. The news broke within hours. Crosstech CEO seeks DNA, confirmation in divorce battle. Financial headlines blurred into tabloid frenzy. Commentators speculated about infidelity. Social media did what it always did. It chose sides without facts. Inside Crosstech headquarters, the boardroom television played the coverage on mute. Directors avoided looking directly at Damian, but the shift in posture was undeniable. Reputation risk was no longer abstract. Was this necessary? The chairman asked carefully. Damian's tone was controlled, but sharper than usual. It protects shareholder interests. Any future financial obligations must be legally clarified. The implication hung in the air. Across Manhattan, Savannah sat in the quiet of Caldwell Sovereign Capital's private office suite. The headline notification appeared on her phone while she was reviewing documentation with Nathan. She read it once, then again. Nathan's jaw tightened. We can challenge the motion. Savannah's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. The baby shifted, steady, alive, innocent. He thinks this destabilizes me, she said softly. The humiliation was intentional, public, strategic. Damian believed doubt would weaken her position in the board fight, that investors would see her as emotional, compromised, potentially manipulative. He underestimated one thing: truth. Within 48 hours, the court-approved test was expedited under media pressure. Savannah did not protest. She did not hide. The results came back faster than anyone expected. Confirmed biological father, Damian Cross. Financial news pivoted overnight. CEO's paternity claim backfires. Board questions, judgment amid personal turmoil. Back at headquarters, Damian stared at the report on his desk. The clean, clinical language offered no room for reinterpretation. For the first time since this began, something inside him faltered. He had meant to corner her. Instead, he had exposed himself. And somewhere beyond, stock charts and shareholder percentages, a deeper consequence was forming, one he had not yet calculated. The private dining room at the Ritz-Carlton overlooked a muted stretch of Manhattan, the late afternoon light filtering through tall windows in quiet gold. Damian arrived first. He had chosen the location deliberately. Neutral territory, understated luxury, controlled environment. His Rolex caught the light as he checked the time. 4:58 p.m. At exactly 5 o'clock, Everett Caldwell entered. No entourage, no theatrics, just a tailored charcoal suit and the presence of a man who had shaped markets without ever chasing headlines. Damian stood. Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Cross. They shook hands, firm, measured, no smiles. They sat. A server poured sparkling water and disappeared. I assume this isn't a social call, Damian began. Everett folded his hands calmly. My daughter has endured public humiliation. Damian's expression hardened slightly. Your daughter and I are resolving a private matter. Everett held his gaze. You made it public. Silence lingered between them, not tense, but heavy with implication. You're leveraging corporate pressure to influence a divorce, Damian said carefully. Everett tilted his head. I'm protecting shareholder interests. The words landed with precision. Damian leaned back. Savannah never mentioned her connection to Caldwell Sovereign. She chose not to use it, Everett replied evenly. She wanted to be loved without advantage. That statement unsettled Damien more than any stock fluctuation. She walked away from voting rights 5 years ago, Everett continued, from capital, from inheritance. For you. The air shifted. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the avenue below. I built Crosstech from nothing, Damien said. No one handed me control. Everett's eyes did not waver. Control is rarely permanent. It is leased, by performance. A subtle warning. You're threatening governance restructuring, Damien pressed. I'm reminding you, Everett corrected. That reckless judgment has consequences. The paternity accusation, the media spectacle, the destabilized board. Damien understood now. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standards. As Everett rose to leave, he paused. My daughter does not need your empire. A beat. But you may soon discover how much your empire needs her. When the door closed behind him, Damien remained seated. For the first time, he felt the weight of something he couldn't negotiate. Respect, and the cost of losing it. The board vote was scheduled for 9 a.m. By 8:30, Crosstech's executive floor felt unfamiliar, quieter, colder, watchful. Directors arrived without small talk. Legal counsel sat closer than usual. Even the assistants avoided eye contact. Damien stood at the head of the table, hands braced lightly against polished glass. He had barely slept. The paternity report had backfired. Media analysts were now questioning not Savannah's credibility, but his judgment. Market confidence was no longer theoretical. It was fragile. Let's proceed, the chairman said. Legal counsel summarized the situation. Escalating shareholder pressure, volatility triggered by executive conduct, concerns regarding fiduciary discretion. Then came the motion. Temporary suspension of executive authority pending governance review. The words echoed in the room. Damien's jaw tightened. This is disproportionate. It's protective, one director replied. For the company. The vote was not dramatic. It was procedural, measured. 7 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention. The decision carried. For the first time since founding Crosstech in a shared co-working space a decade ago, Damien Cross was no longer in control of his own boardroom. Lila sat very still. Too still. As directors began filing out, Damien turned to her. We weather this, he said quietly. She offered a faint, professional nod. Of course. But as she gathered her tablet, a secure message appeared briefly across her screen before she angled it away. Orion increasing position. Phase 2 ready. She slipped the device into her bag, without hesitation. Across town, in Caldwell Sovereign Capital's Manhattan office, Savannah received confirmation of the vote. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply closed her eyes for a moment. This was not destruction. It was correction. Her phone buzzed again, a notification that Orion Strategic had quietly expanded its stake to 8.1%, 2 forces tightening at once. Savannah looked out at the skyline. Damien believed the fracture began with the divorce papers. He was wrong. It began the moment he mistook power for permanence, and the deeper break had only just started. The headlines changed tone by Thursday morning. What had started as a divorce scandal was now framed as executive instability. Board suspends Crosstech CEO. Questions mount over internal liquidity shifts. Damien read them alone in his office, technically still his, though access permissions had already begun shifting quietly around him. His name remained on the door. For now. Across the city, Orion Strategic filed an updated disclosure. 8.1% became 9.3%. That kind of acceleration wasn't random. In the Crosstech interim leadership meeting, forensic accountants presented new findings. Executive-level stock liquidations had occurred just hours before the governance suspension vote. All properly filed, all technically legal, but strategically precise. Damien's eyes slowly moved toward Lila. She didn't flinch. "It was diversification," she said calmly. "I reduced exposure during volatility. That's prudent, not criminal." The room remained still. Prudent if you weren't simultaneously encouraging leadership stability in public statements. The chairman folded his hands. "Orion's acquisitions align almost perfectly with your divestments." Coincidence again. But patterns were forming. Lila leaned back slightly, her tone measured. "Are we now punishing executives for protecting personal assets?" The question deflected responsibility, yet the timing lingered. After the meeting adjourned, Damien followed her into the hallway. "Tell me you didn't coordinate with Orion," he said quietly. Her expression softened, just enough to suggest concern. "I protected myself," she replied. "You should have done the same." The words landed heavier than accusation. Across Manhattan, Savannah received a secured update from Nathan. "We have confirmation. Communication trails exist. Not public yet." Savannah closed her eyes briefly. She had anticipated conflict. She had not expected betrayal this layered. Back at Crosstech, Damien stood alone in the boardroom after hours, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. He had built this company from instinct and speed. Now instinct felt unreliable. For the first time, he questioned the one person he had trusted inside the room, and somewhere beneath the corporate maneuvering and shareholder percentages, a more personal realization was taking shape. He hadn't just misjudged Savannah, he had misjudged the people closest to him, and the cost of that miscalculation was about to multiply. By Friday, the story was no longer about divorce, it was about credibility. Crosstech's stock opened down another 5.6% after pre-market analysts flagged executive judgment risk in a widely circulated note. Financial networks replayed clips of Damien's past interviews. Bold promises, aggressive forecasts, unwavering confidence. Now the tone was different. Was the CEO distracted? Did personal instability affect corporate oversight? Inside Crosstech headquarters, Damien's access card no longer granted entry to the executive server room. A subtle change. Temporary, according to the board. Temporary felt permanent. He stood in the glass-walled conference room that had once carried his authority effortlessly. The skyline beyond seemed colder, more distant. For the first time in years, he had no calendar full of decisions waiting for him. Instead, he had questions. Compliance officers had initiated a formal review into executive stock movements. Nothing criminal, yet. But enough to trigger mandatory disclosures. And Orion Strategic had just crossed 10%. 10% meant influence. Influence meant negotiation power. Across town, Savannah sat at a long oak table inside Caldwell Sovereign Capital's Manhattan office. Nathan placed a thin folder in front of her. "Preliminary communication trail," he said quietly. "Encrypted calls, secondary devices, timing correlations between Lila's divestments and Orion's accumulation windows." Savannah scanned the pages slowly. She did not feel triumph. She felt clarity. Back at Crosstech, Damien finally confronted Lila directly. "Did you signal them?" he asked. She held his gaze calmly. "You're looking for someone to blame. Answer the question." "I made strategic decisions," she replied evenly. The board made theirs. The distance between them widened in that moment. He had mistaken alignment for loyalty. And loyalty, he was discovering, was never contractual. By evening, financial news broke another development. Orion formally requested 2 board seats. The empire Damien built wasn't collapsing in flames. It was being dismantled with paperwork, layer by layer, quietly. And for the first time, Damien Cross understood that power once fractured, does not return easily. The storm rolled in just after midnight. Rain pressed against the hospital windows in steady sheets, blurring the Manhattan skyline into streaks of silver and shadow. Inside the private maternity wing on the Upper East Side, the world narrowed to fluorescent lights, quiet footsteps, and the steady rhythm of a monitor tracking a fragile heartbeat. Savannah gripped the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction surged through her. "Breathe," the nurse reminded gently. She did. Inhale. Hold. Release. There were no cameras here, no board votes, no shareholder reports, only the sound of rain and the small life fighting to enter the world. Her phone, silenced on the side table, had dozens of missed notifications. Financial updates, media speculation, legal briefs. None of it mattered in this room. Across town, Damien sat alone in his dark apartment, staring at his own phone screen. Nathan's message had been brief. "She's in labor." He hadn't expected the timing to hit this hard. For weeks, everything had been strategy, containment, negotiation, damage control. Now the reality cut through all of it. He grabbed his coat without thinking. At the hospital entrance, he hesitated before approaching the front desk. His name still carried recognition, privilege, access. But not here. "Immediate family only," the nurse said calmly after checking the file. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He had forfeited that position. Upstairs, Savannah felt the final surge of pain, sharper than anything before. And then, a cry. Strong, clear, alive. Tears slipped down her temples as the nurse placed the baby gently against her chest. "It's a boy," she whispered, even though she already knew. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around hers. Outside the delivery room, Damien stood alone in the hallway, hearing the cry through the closed door. For the first time since this began, he felt something that had nothing to do with power. Loss. Inside, Savannah kissed her son's forehead. "Welcome," she whispered softly. The empire could fracture. Markets could shift. But in that moment, something far more permanent had just been born. 3 days after the birth, the markets opened to a quiet shock. At 8:12 a.m., Caldwell Sovereign Capital filed an updated disclosure with the SEC, increased voting authority through full activation of previously escrowed shares. The language was precise, clinical, unemotional. Effective immediately, Caldwell-controlled voting power in Crosstech Dynamics rose to 38.7%. That number changed everything. So in the interim boardroom, directors sat straighter. Orion Strategics representatives dialed in remotely, their faces projected across the wall display. The chairman cleared his throat. With Caldwell now holding controlling leverage, governance restructuring must be finalized. Damien was not present. He had been formally transitioned to advisory status pending final review. Across town, Savannah sat in a quiet recovery suite, her newborn sleeping against her chest. Soft morning light spilled across the room. The world felt slower here, measured in breaths instead of headlines. Her phone buzzed. "Nathan." "It's done," he said simply. She closed her eyes briefly. 5 years ago, she had walked away from her father's empire to build something honest. Now that empire had stepped forward, not to destroy, but to stabilize. At Caldwell's Manhattan office, Everett signed the final directive, transferring operational oversight authority to Savannah as majority voting representative. "You don't have to take this," he told her later over a secure video call. "I know," she replied. But this wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about responsibility. Back at Crosstech headquarters, the official statement was released. Effective immediately, Savannah Whitmore has been appointed chairwoman of the board. The news cycle exploded. Estranged wife assumes control. Power shift in billion-dollar tech firm. In the hospital room, Savannah looked down at her son. "I won't lead with revenge," she whispered softly. Outside, cameras began gathering in front of Crosstech's tower. Inside the building, employees read the announcement in stunned silence. Then Damien watched the notification appear on his phone. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, he understood the full weight of what he had dismissed. She had never needed his empire. Now, she owned its future. The first time Savannah walked back into Crosstech headquarters as chairwoman, there were no cameras inside the building, only silence. The glass lobby that once reflected her as the CEO's wife now reflected something entirely different. She wore a tailored ivory suit, understated, deliberate. No dramatic entrance, no entourage, just Nathan walking one step behind her, carrying a slim leather folder. Employees paused mid-conversation as she passed. Some looked curious, some relieved, some uncertain. Power shifts always unsettled the air. Inside the executive boardroom, the Manhattan skyline stretched wide and bright beyond the glass walls. The same skyline Damien had once believed belonged to him. Savannah took the head seat, not triumphantly, calmly. The interim chairman began. "Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore. The floor is yours." She placed her hands lightly on the table. "Effective immediately," she began, her voice steady. "We will prioritize operational transparency and internal audit stabilization. No layoffs, no panic restructuring." A visible exhale moved through the room. Markets reacted quickly to fear. Employees reacted faster. "We built innovative technology," she continued, "but innovation without accountability is fragile." Orion's representatives exchanged glances. This was not the aggressive corporate warfare they expected. It was reform. Nathan slid forward a document. "An internal compliance review has identified communication discrepancies between executive transactions and external fund movements." The room stiffened. Lila Monroe sat perfectly still. Savannah turned toward her, not with anger, but clarity. "Ms. Monroe, pending investigation, you are relieved of fiduciary authority effective immediately." Gasps were subtle but real. Lila's composure cracked, just slightly. "This is procedural," Savannah added, "not personal." Security entered quietly. No spectacle. Across town, Damien received the live update. Lila suspended. Compliance review expanding. He stared at the screen, understanding dawning too late. Savannah did not dismantle the company. She restored it. And in doing so, she revealed the one truth Damien had ignored from the beginning. Power is not proven by domination. It is proven by discipline. The investigation did not explode overnight. It unfolded. Quietly. Methodically. Within 48 hours of Lila Monroe's suspension, Crosstech's internal compliance team delivered a preliminary report to the board. Encrypted communications between Lila's secondary device and an Orion strategic intermediary had been flagged. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with her stock divestments. Not illegal, at first glance, but coordinated. And coordination, in financial markets, carried weight. By Monday morning, the SEC formally opened an inquiry. Financial media pivoted again. CFO under investigation. Orion's strategy linked to insider timing. In a sleek downtown apartment overlooking the Hudson, Lila watched the news in silence. Her phone vibrated relentlessly. Attorneys, journalists, the former allies suddenly cautious. The calm precision she had once carried began to fracture. Across town, Savannah sat in her office, her newborn's photo placed discreetly beside her MacBook. She did not smile at the headlines. She did not celebrate. "This is about restoring trust," she told Nathan quietly. In the Crosstech boardroom, Savannah addressed senior leadership. "We cooperate fully," she stated. No obstruction, no narrative manipulation. Transparency steadied the markets faster than aggression ever could. By afternoon, Orion Strategic publicly distanced itself from Lila, issuing a statement claiming no knowledge of internal communications. The irony was sharp. The fund that had moved aggressively now retreated to protect its own valuation. Lila's attorney requested emergency negotiations, but the documentation trail was growing. Damien read every update in isolation. The woman he had trusted in strategy sessions, the one who had stood beside him at the plaza, was now the focal point of federal inquiry. He replayed every conversation in his mind, every assurance, every nod. He had mistaken proximity for loyalty, and loyalty, he was learning too late, cannot be bought with access. By evening, Lila formally resigned from all executive positions. Crosstech stock rose 4.2% on the news, not because someone had fallen, but because accountability had finally arrived. Savannah closed her office window as the Manhattan lights flickered on below. Justice was not dramatic. It was precise, and it always moved, eventually, toward balance. The final board vote was not dramatic. It was definitive. Crosstech's shareholders convened in a secured hybrid session, some present in the Manhattan headquarters, others dialed in from San Francisco, London, and Singapore. Financial press waited outside, hungry for a decisive headline. Inside the boardroom, the skyline stood bright and indifferent beyond the glass. Savannah sat at the head of the table, composed, her expression steady. To her right, independent directors. To her left, legal counsel. Across the room, Damien occupied a seat that once symbolized command. Now, it symbolized review. The chairman spoke first. Given the findings of the compliance investigation, executive judgment concerns, and shareholder pressure, we proceed to a formal leadership restructuring vote. No raised voices, no spectacle, just process. Damien's hands remained folded. He had prepared arguments about innovation pipelines, long-term contracts, his role in building Crosstech from nothing. But somewhere along the way, those arguments had lost weight. The vote passed with overwhelming majority. Damien Cross was formally removed as CEO. He retained minority equity. He retained wealth, but he no longer controlled the company he had once defined as himself. The announcement was released within minutes. Markets responded calmly, almost optimistically. Crosstech stock ticked upward 2.1%. Stability restored. Outside the building, reporters surged. Inside, Savannah rose from her seat and walked toward Damien. There was no hostility in her posture, only clarity. "This didn't have to end this way," he said quietly. She met his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It didn't." There was no triumph in her voice, only truth. He had signed divorce papers, believing he was shedding weakness. Instead, he had severed the one person who would have strengthened him. As security escorted him through the private exit, the lobby felt larger than before, emptier. Power had not been taken from him. It had been transferred through consequence. And in the silence that followed, Crosstech did not feel like an empire lost. It felt like one corrected. 6 months later, Manhattan woke slowly beneath a pale gold sky. Savannah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, her son resting peacefully in her arms. Central Park stretched below, brushed with early light. The city moved the way it always had, indifferent, relentless, alive. But everything inside her felt different. Crosstech had stabilized. The governance reforms she implemented were now cited in financial journals as a model for crisis recovery. Employee retention had risen. Innovation pipelines resumed. Investors returned, not because of spectacle, but because of structure. Power, she had learned, did not need to shout. It needed to endure. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk beside her. A message from Nathan Reed. Board meeting at noon? And coffee afterward? A faint smile touched her lips. Nathan had never pushed, never positioned himself as savior. He had stood beside her in silence when silence mattered most. In the month since the birth, he had visited often, not to discuss strategy, but to ask how she was sleeping, whether she was eating, whether she was okay. Respect first. Everything else later. Across the river, a Damian Cross walked alone along a quieter stretch of waterfront. He had accepted a consulting role with a smaller tech firm, still respected, still wealthy, but no longer central to the skyline he once believed he owned. He watched the sun rise over the city and finally understood something simple. You can build an empire, but if you mistake control for character, the empire will correct you. Back in her office, Savannah kissed her son's forehead gently. You will grow up knowing love, she whispered, not leverage. There would be new challenges, new negotiations, new storms. But this time, she stood rooted, not as someone reclaiming power, but as someone who never truly needed it to begin with. Outside, the city gleamed. Inside, she felt peace. And just like that, the story comes to an end. But my dear friends, you're still here, sure, aren't you? If you've stayed with this story until now, then something in it must have touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it was the betrayal. Maybe it was the silence Savannah carried with dignity. Or maybe it was the reminder that power without character eventually collapses under its own weight. Here's the truth we can take into our own lives. Control is temporary, but integrity is lasting. The Stoics used to say, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Marcus Aurelius wrote that, and Savannah lived it. She didn't fight with noise. She didn't destroy in anger. She mastered herself first. And in doing so, she regained everything that truly mattered. This story isn't about revenge. It's about self-respect. It's about understanding that when someone underestimates you, you don't respond with chaos. You respond with growth. And sometimes, the greatest comeback is simply becoming unshakable. So if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, take a second. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs courage today. And subscribe to the channel so we can keep growing together. Because the real empire we're building here, it's resilience. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment, emotional reflection, and storytelling purposes only. While it references realistic settings such as Manhattan, corporate boardrooms, and recognizable financial institutions, the characters, companies, and events portrayed are entirely fictional and not intended to represent any real individuals, organizations, or ongoing legal matters. Themes involving divorce, corporate governance, financial investigations, and personal conflict are dramatized to explore emotional growth, accountability, and resilience. No claims are made about real-life business practices, specific companies, or public figures. The narrative does not provide legal, financial, or investment advice. Viewer discretion is encouraged, and the purpose of this content is to inspire thoughtful reflection on integrity, responsibility, and personal strength, rather than to depict factual events.